ever get that feeling like you just want to cut through all the noise, all the distractions, and really get a handle on something that matters?
Absolutely.
Well, that's exactly what we're all about here. Today, we're going deep, real deep, into Gavin de Becker's book, The Gift of Fear.
It's a great word.
It's a powerful book. And think of this deep dive as like a guided tour of your own personal built-in danger detection system, right?
Yeah.
Like how to really understand those instincts we all have.
Yeah. And this book, it really offers, well, I think, a perspective shift.
Mm.
And it draws on decades of de Becker's work,
Yeah.
assessing and predicting violent behavior. And today we're using excerpts from the Kindle edition to focus on the core insights. This idea that we all have this innate ability to sense danger. And we're diving into that. We're going deep.
That's the central mission here, right? To really get a grasp on this this gift of fear, as de Becker calls it. And we want to help you, the listener, learn to actually recognize those often very subtle internal alarms.
Yeah.
And to understand what he calls the universal code of violence.
Absolutely.
It's not just random, right? Bad things don't just happen.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. Behavior, it really speaks volumes often before a word is even uttered.
Yeah, for sure. And let's jump right in with a story that really, I think, sets the stage. It's Kelly's experience. So picture this, right? She's coming home from the grocery store, arms full of bags. She gets to her apartment building, and what do you know? The door's unlatched again?
Oh, an unlatched door. That's never good.
Yeah. At first, she's kind of annoyed, but then it's like, oh, well, whatever. At least I don't have to fumble for my keys.
A small convenience.
Yeah, exactly. But as she's heading up the stairs, one of the bags tears.
Oh, no.
Cat food spills everywhere. And just then, like right on cue, this young man appears seemingly out of nowhere and offers to help. And here's the thing. Even though this guy seems, friendly enough, Kelly gets this instant prickle of unease. That feeling, that little voice.
What?
But she kind of brushes it aside because, she doesn't want to seem rude. Plus, he's, good looking. He's persistent. But he keeps pushing to help, even after she kind of hesitates. And I think that's a key insight right there, don't you think? Even that smallest, flicker of unease, it shouldn't be ignored.
Absolutely. You've got to listen to that. And what follows, it's really telling. He offers these little details. His watch is broken, he's late, the cat's hungry. He's almost over-explaining his presence.
Right.
It's a tactic, and we'll revisit this later. And then Kelly, she lets go of the grocery bag.
Right.
That seemingly small act, what do you see as significant about that moment?
It's like almost a subconscious surrender, right? A yielding of control. Maybe it signals to him, okay, yeah, I'm willing to accept your help, your presence.
Exactly. And he starts using we statements, like, all right, we've got a hungry cat up there, creating this false sense of shared purpose when really there isn't one. This forced teaming, as de Becker calls it. This is a huge signal to watch for.
Right.
And remember, if you didn't ask for help, this stranger's insistence on a we scenario, that should really raise a red flag, big time.
Huge red flag, yeah. And so they reach her apartment, and things escalate horribly. He rapes her. He threatens to kill her.
Oh, my God.
But here's the critical point. It's after the assault, when he's getting dressed and he closes the window, that Kelly experiences this just profound visceral fear, like she is certain he's going to kill her.
Right.
So what's so significant about that closed window, in that moment?
It's the detail that doesn't fit, right? He's dressed. He's about to go. Why secure the window? It suggests he's containing something, maybe preventing sound from escaping. And that's when her real fear kicks in, as de Becker describes it. Not just fear of the act itself, but primal fear for her survival. This is the kind of fear that becomes like an ally.
Wow, yeah.
It can save you.
And it does. It propels her into action. She instinctively follows him down the stairs, even when he does something kind of illogical, like leaving her front door wide open. And she goes to a neighbor's apartment, knowing somehow that their door will be unlocked.
Wow.
And she gets help. And later, she pinpoints it, right? The closed window.
That one detail.
That's the signal. The signal that her intuition had flagged all along, but she ignored. So what's the takeaway here, the biggest takeaway from Kelly's story?
It's the distinction, I think, between, just everyday anxiety and that deep intuitive fear.
Right.
It's a signal, not a feeling to be dismissed. And by finally, recognizing it, trusting it, Kelly not only survived, but she also gained this lasting confidence.
Right.
She actually experienced a reduction in her overall fear. And de Becker argues that this same capacity, it exists within you, within all of us.
Wow. And that is powerful. And I think, brings us to why we so often ignore these signals. It's easier, isn't it, to think that violence is just this random, unpredictable thing.
Sure.
Just bolt out of the blue. Nobody could have seen it coming, right? That's what we tell ourselves.
We like to think that.
Yeah.
But de Becker, he challenges that head on. He
Yeah.
suggests, this desire to see violence as random, well, it serves a purpose.
Right.
It allows us to kind of abdicate responsibility.
Right.
The responsibility to learn, to observe, to trust ourselves.
Yeah.
If it's all just bad luck, then, we can't be faulted for not being prepared, right?
Yeah. We buy into these comfortable myths.
We do.
Right. Violence is rare. It happens to other people. There are no warning signs.
Right.
But his premise, the book's premise, is that behavior is detectable. Patterns exist if we know what to look for.
Exactly.
So think about this for a second. What if violence wasn't entirely random?
Right.
What would that mean for you as the listener?
It means we can become more aware.
Yeah.
More empowered. Look at these questions that de Becker raises in the book.
Right.
How do you assess the potential harm from someone you're worried about? What about the reaction of a fired employee? How do you handle someone who just refuses to let go, respond to threats? Even how do you assess the safety of your children's caregivers? These aren't mysteries.
Right.
They have answers that are rooted in an understanding of human behavior.
Right. And he's not just guessing, right? Like, de Becker has built his expertise over, 4 decades.
Okay.
Yeah. Observing countless instances of violence, making these high-stakes predictions involving violence and even death, he's taken this concept of intuition, which, can seem so mystical, so out there, and found a system within it.
It's there.
Yeah. So if this gift of fear, this intuition, is inherent in all of us, why do we so often override it?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
And it leads to the crucial importance of trusting your intuition.
Right.
And the real dangers of denying those inner signals.
It's real. So think about this. You're waiting for an elevator, right? The door's open and someone steps in and you get that feeling.
Yeah.
Something feels wrong.
Yeah.
What do? Do you politely ignore that feeling, maybe tell yourself you're being judgmental and step in anyway?
Or do you listen to that little bell going off in your head and wait for the next elevator?
Right. Which actually seems more logical when you really think about it. A minor inconvenience or, potentially putting yourself in a confined space with someone who's giving you the creeps.
It's a no-brainer when you frame it that way.
Right. Exactly. De Becker, he emphasizes this, that this inner voice, it's a powerful source of wisdom. It's there to protect you.
Absolutely.
And even when we do hear that voice clearly, I think we often seek external validation, don't we? We're like, oh, am I really feeling this? Should I be feeling this? And there's this really telling anecdote in the book about a psychiatrist whose patient was avoiding his wife. And the patient, he wondered, well, am I unconsciously avoiding sex?
Interesting.
But what if the unconscious part was actually the perfectly valid feeling of unease?
Yeah.
That maybe there was a reason he was avoiding her.
Right.
Sometimes the most obvious explanation, the one your gut's pointing to, that's the right one. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. It's similar to when victims of violence, in hindsight, they say things like, oh, I unconsciously knew I was in danger.
Right.
But, de Becker suggests they likely knew it consciously but dismissed it, maybe to be polite or to appear reasonable,
Right. Exactly. And we have this strange way of evaluating risk, I think. Don't you think?
For sure.
We can get hyper-focused on these low probability, high visibility events, like a terrorist attack, right?
Yeah.
But we neglect these everyday risks that are far more likely to actually affect us, like basic road safety or even just, being aware of the people we interact with every day.
It's true. Dr. Melvin Konner makes this great point about, canceling a trip because of some minuscule terror threat, but then driving recklessly without a seatbelt.
Right.
It's like, come on. We tend to tolerate familiar risks, the things we're used to, while being super vigilant about the novel ones. And it's almost as if the unfamiliar just feels inherently more threatening just because it's outside our routine.
Right. Exactly. And it's ultimately our brains that are filtering this information, right? Like, as James Burke put it is the brain which sees, not the eye. And we need to have these pieces of the violence puzzle already kind of in place in our understanding and our awareness to be able to actually recognize those danger signals when they pop up.
Absolutely.
What are some of those pieces, those key things that you think we need to be aware of?
Understanding, I think, basic human motivations,
Right.
recognizing manipulative behaviors
Yeah.
and trusting our own emotional responses.
Right.
Those are huge pieces.
Yeah.
And, that Harris poll that shows that Americans are, you know, most concerned about crime and personal safety.
Right.
Well, that's telling. But how much effort do we really put into actually understanding those dynamics, the dynamics of violence, compared to, say, economic trends or something?
Right.
It's like we're worried about it, but we're not really doing anything to understand it.
Yeah. And the media, I think, often focuses on the aftermath, right?
For sure.
Like the whodunit aspect of things instead of the how could this have been prevented?
Right. Absolutely.
And relying solely on these external experts, law enforcement or security professionals, it can actually prevent us from developing our own inherent abilities.
Yeah, sure.
We need to trust our own judgment. What's the message in that? The empowering message for you?
The empowerment is recognizing that you are your own first and most crucial line of defense.
Yeah.
Developing your own awareness. This
Right.
isn't about being paranoid. It's about being in tune with reality.
Yeah, totally. And to do that, we have to confront a sometimes uncomfortable truth.
Mm-hmm.
The truth is, violence, it's a human thing.
It is.
It's not some alien thing committed by, monsters who are totally separate from us.
Right.
We like to think that, but
Well, de Becker, he emphasizes that understanding and predicting violence, it begins with understanding ourselves. Nicholas Humphrey, he had this concept that we're all natural psychologists. We're constantly modeling other people's behavior based on our own internal experience.
right.
And that's key. We need to understand what it means to be human. The good, the bad, and the ugly.
Right, all of it. And the case of Robert Bardo, who murdered Rebecca Schaefer, the actress.
Tragic.
Tragic, yeah. That was a real turning point for de Becker, in terms of this understanding. And his interactions with Bardo, they revealed a shared humanness that really, blurs the lines.
It does.
Right? Like the comfortable lines we draw between us and them. It's unsettling to think, that we might share some fundamental aspects with someone capable of such a horrific act.
Carl Menninger, he said this: everyone's mind is criminal. We're all capable of criminal fantasies and thoughts.
Wow.
It highlights this universal potential, this dark side that we all have. And even, Einstein and Freud, they had this exchange where they explore this human need to hate and destroy.
Wow.
It points to this duality within us. We all have this capacity for both good and evil. And violence and homicide, they're tragically universal. You see them across all cultures. And while that us and them mentality, it can make us feel safer in the short term,
Right.
de Becker, he argues it actually makes it harder to predict real danger.
Right.
We need to recognize that these acts are committed by people, within our shared human experience, not by monsters from another planet.
Right.
They're us.
How do we bridge that gap then, that us and them gap in our thinking? What's a practical way?
Maybe by focusing on shared emotions,
Yeah.
and shared motivations, even in like drastically different contexts.
Right.
Fear, anger, the desire for connection. These are all universal human experiences.
Yeah.
And they can give us clues, even in understanding, the most extreme behaviors.
Yeah.
And this isn't about excusing violence at all. It's about understanding its roots. They had this patient pets program at a Atascadero State Hospital. It was amazing.
Yeah.
These were violent inmates, but they cared for animals. And it showed that even these individuals, people who had committed terrible acts, they still had a capacity for empathy. And when one of the guinea pigs died, their distress was real. It was palpable.
Wow.
It just showed that even in the darkest of places, that spark of humanity, it can still exist.
Right. And de Becker poses this really powerful thought experiment. Can you even imagine the worst thing a human being could do?
It's a tough one to think about.
Yeah.
But, the fact that you can conceive of it, however horrific, means it lies within the realm of human capability.
Right.
And these aren't acts committed by some other species. They're done by people who are fundamentally part of us.
Yeah.
Robert Ressler said it best, about Ed Gein, that infamous serial killer. He said, nothing human is foreign.
Wow.
And to recognize risk, you have to understand the full spectrum of human behavior, including the dark side.
That's powerful. And that understanding, that spectrum of behavior, that's what helps us to identify what de Becker calls key survival signals. These are those concrete behavioral indicators, the red flags, that can really give us some warning, some insight into underlying intent.
Absolutely.
The first one he talks about is forced teaming.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like, in a real-world situation?
It's a manipulation tactic where someone tries to establish this false sense of connection or shared purpose. They do it by using we statements when really there's no genuine partnership there.
Right.
Remember in Kelly's story, the stranger said, "We've got a hungry cat up there."
Right.
That's classic forced teaming.
Yeah. It's like when you've just met someone and they're acting like your old friends.
Exactly.
Sharing secrets or making all these assumptions about your shared interests when there's no basis for it.
Exactly. David Mamet's House of Games, that film, it gives a great example, a fictional example of this with the Western Union con,
Right.
where the con artist creates this false sense of vulnerability and shared purpose to gain the protagonist's trust. So how should you, the listener, respond if you encounter this tactic?
De Becker, he suggests a direct and unambiguous refusal. Something like, I did not ask for your help and I do not want it.
Straight to the point.
Yeah. It might feel rude, but your safety comes first. Why is that directness so important?
Because forced teaming, it thrives on blurring those boundaries. And a clear no, it reestablishes them immediately.
Right.
And remember, rudeness is relative. Someone who's trying to manipulate you, to draw you into this false sense of connection.
Right.
Well, they're the ones behaving inappropriately.
Right.
First teaming from a stranger, especially toward a woman who's in a potentially vulnerable situation, it's never okay. And don't be swayed by that generally positive view of rapport building. Sometimes it's just plain self-serving.
Yeah. And another really important signal is too many details. Why is an overabundance of information? Why is that sometimes a red flag?
Because deceptive people, they feel this need to overcompensate, to convince you.
Right.
And they do it with this avalanche of unnecessary information. They want to sound credible.
Right.
Keep back to the stranger with Kelly. He gives this whole elaborate explanation about the hungry cat. But it's not even his cat, it's his friend's cat.
Right.
And then he goes on about the open door, how it's like in the old movies, and then mentions his broken watch, which is why he's late. These details weren't solicited, they just spill out.
Right. Like he's trying too hard.
Exactly. And truth tellers, they generally don't feel that need, to give you all these extra unprompted details. Liars, even if their story sounds plausible on the surface, they're often aware of the inconsistencies. So they just keep talking, trying to plug any holes in your perception.
What's the danger for you, the listener, in getting caught up in these details?
Well, it can distract you from the bigger picture, the context of the situation. It's like focusing so much on each individual tree that you completely miss the fact that you're standing in a dangerous forest. Perfect analogy. It's like, watching individual scenes flash by from a speeding train. Eventually, those specifics, they just blur and you lose sight of the overall landscape. And in the same way, too many details can obscure the context. And in Kelly's case, the context is simple. This was a stranger approaching her at night, offering unsolicited assistance repeatedly. So what's the defense against this tactic?
De Becker's advice is to consciously bring the context back into your awareness.
Yes.
If it's a stranger giving you all these overly detailed explanations late at night, the details themselves become less important than the fact that it's a stranger, it's late, and you didn't ask for this interaction.
Exactly.
It's
It's about the big picture, not the little details.
Yeah, totally. And then there's the power of that simple word no.
Such a powerful word.
Right. Which I think should never be up for negotiation.
Never.
Kelly, she initially showed no non-verbally, but then she caved to his persistence. So what's the critical understanding here about no that De Becker wants us to really internalize?
No is a complete sentence.
Yes.
It's a firm boundary that requires no further explanation.
Right.
And anyone who refuses to accept that no, well, they're trying to exert control.
Right.
And this isn't just about physical safety. This applies to all kinds of relationships.
It does.
Pushy date, a demanding friend, a controlling partner. Refusing to respect that no, it's a huge red flag.
Yeah.
And if you give in, if you relent on your no, it signals that you're willing to be controlled.
Yeah.
And what's the worst way to respond to someone who won't take no for an answer?
Well, weakening your refusal, right? Starting to negotiate, explain yourself, that just invites them to keep pushing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
De Becker points out that this is all part of the interview process.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That potential aggressors use to identify individuals who are most vulnerable, the people who are less likely to assert their boundaries and stick to them.
Yeah. And this brings us to, I think, a really important consideration, which is the gender differences in how we experience and process fear. Women often navigate the world with this constant vigilance
Mm.
that many men, I think, just don't experience. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. Think about this. Ask a man, when was the last time you felt genuine fear for your safety? He might have to really think back, months, years even.
Right.
Now, ask a woman the same question. Chances are she'll have a very recent, very specific instance,
Yeah,
and yet we often dismiss or minimize
hmm
women's safety concerns,
we do.
even the people closest to them sometimes.
It's true.
But de Becker's message to women, it's powerful. Trust your survival instinct.
Yeah.
It's a finely tuned system,
Yep.
and it knows way more about your safety than societal expectations or anyone else's opinion.
Right. Absolutely. And the book makes this stark comparison. At their core, men, they often fear being ridiculed, appearing weak. But women at their core often fear being harmed, being killed.
That's a fundamental difference.
Yeah. And that difference, in those basic fears, it shapes how we perceive and react to these potential threats.
Absolutely. And intuition, this gift of fear, it speaks to us in so many ways. De Becker calls these the messengers of intuition. So what are some of the forms these messages can take?
Well, they can be those nagging feelings that you just can't quite shake, the
Yeah.
persistent thoughts that keep circling in your mind, even a sudden shift in your humor,
Right.
like that dark or inappropriate laughter in a serious situation,
Yeah.
wonder, anxiety, just the simple curiosity about something that feels off, a gut feeling, doubt, hesitation, suspicion, apprehension, and of course, overt fear itself.
They're all messengers. Kelly, her initial apprehension, that was a messenger.
Right,
China Leonard, she had that persistent thought about her son's surgery.
right.
Bob Taylor, his dark humor.
Yeah.
It was a signal about that potential bomb.
Hmm.
And then there's Nancy, remember her?
Yeah, at the ATM.
At the ATM. She's sitting in her parked car, and she's suddenly overcome with this wave of fear, even though she hasn't seen anyone directly threatening her.
Right.
But what was the signal, the specific thing that she picked up on? Almost subconsciously.
It was just a glimpse of denim in her side mirror.
Just a glimpse.
Yeah. And it was the indication of someone approaching, too quickly.
Mm-hmm.
That tiny detail, that was enough to trigger that alarm.
Yeah. Pay attention to those seemingly small signals. They can hold such vital information.
Yeah. And then, finally, there's this rule of opposites.
Ah, yes.
How can observing someone's behavior in contrast to what seems, logical, how can that reveal their true intent?
Well, it's about looking for the inconsistencies.
Right,
Someone who genuinely wants to know if others are home, they'll just ask directly.
right.
But someone with bad intentions, they might subtly try to figure it out without asking. Maybe they'll look for lights or listen for sounds.
Right.
It's the opposite of a direct inquiry. Or, someone not paying much attention, that's normal.
Right.
But someone staring intently, that can be a warning sign.
Yeah.
Think about someone who's all rushed at the airport. Their behavior, it probably means they're trying to catch a flight.
Right.
It makes sense in the context. But the rule of opposites is about those behaviors that don't align with a logical explanation in a given situation.
Right. And the book touches on high-stakes predictions. What's the key takeaway there?
The pre-incident indicators, they'll be specific to whatever outcome you're trying to predict.
Okay.
The warning signs for someone who's suicidal will be different from those of someone planning a violent attack. It's not one size fits all.
Right. And let's talk about the logic of violence. What makes violence more likely to happen?
One crucial factor is perceived alternatives.
Okay.
If someone believes they have no other way to get what they want, violence becomes more likely.
Okay. So, for example, someone who wants their job back, they probably understand that violence would be counterproductive.
Right.
But someone who's consumed by a desire for revenge, they might see violence as a viable option.
Exactly. And it's that perceived lack of options,
Yeah.
Even if those perceptions are totally off base, or if the consequences are going to be really bad, it doesn't matter. Someone who feels cornered, like they have no way out,
Yeah.
they're much more likely to resort to extreme measures.
Yeah. And context, as we've said, it plays such a huge role in how we interpret communication and how we assess risk.
For sure.
Can you give an example of how context can completely change the meaning of a message?
Sure. Imagine you get a letter with some, alarming language.
Okay.
But if that letter is from a 50-year-old man to a 10-year-old girl, the context instantly raises the threat level
Yeah.
way higher than if those same words were exchanged between, two adults in a different situation.
Right.
Or, take a seemingly innocent phone message. Hi, honey, it's me. Totally normal, right? But what if that's from a, estranged ex-partner who you're actively trying to avoid,
Right.
who might be dangerous?
Yeah.
The words themselves, they're less important than who's saying them and why.
Totally. And what about threats? How should we understand the nature of threats?
Well, de Becker really emphasizes this. Threats are not guarantees. They're not promises.
Okay.
They're words that are intended to make you afraid. And the power of a threat, it really lies in how the recipient reacts to it.
So if I show fear, I'm actually empowering the person making the threat.
You're validating it in their mind.
Oh.
And while taking precautions is crucial, obviously, outwardly displaying fear, it just feeds the aggressor.
Right.
Even things like bomb threats, they rely on creating this widespread fear.
Right.
It's all about disruption.
So the more alarming the words, the higher the threat level. Right.
Not necessarily. De Becker talks about value reduction statements, which are basically multiple alarming concepts thrown together, often indicating someone who's just venting anger rather than actually having a plan.
So someone could be throwing out all these scary words, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to act on them.
Exactly. It's about context. Alarming words, they're often designed to shock, to scare. Reacting calmly, it allows you to maintain your perception, and assess the actual level of danger.
Right. And the key question to ask yourself is,
Am I in immediate physical danger right now?
right.
That's the bottom line.
Yeah. And let's talk about those people who refuse to let go. What are some of the signs of this behavior?
These are people who persistently try to stay in contact,
Yeah.
even after a clear rejection or breakup.
Right.
They might start small, a seemingly reasonable request. Like in the book, de Becker talks about Tommy, who asked Mike for a letter of recommendation. It sounds harmless enough, but the underlying purpose, it was.